Marty in Evergreen Park, Illinois. You wanted to argue with me about NPR, really?
That is correct, yes, Tom, and thank you so much for taking my call. I just wanted to say here in Chicago area, we've got 3 NPR stations, 2 of which don't air really any news-related programming at all. And the one station that we do have actually augmented that story that you were referring to earlier about the AT&T merger with the facts that this could create a dangerous monopoly. So we have journalists in our local public radio station that do effective journalism and do augment the stories that are brought forth from
Marty. You realize there's a difference between an NPR station and a community radio station?
Well, correct, but they're still NPR member stations. Just
not necessarily. Not necessarily. Typically, you've got one station that has an NPR basically license or franchise or whatever it is in every major market, every market. Then you've got other stations. I can't speak for Chicago. I know when I lived in Portland, you had OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, KOPB, that was the big NPR station. And then you had KBOO, which was the local community station. And they carried no NPR programming. They carried a lot of other local programming. And in fact, at various times and over the years, they've carried my program and not carried this program because we have a nonprofit version of it that's available to those stations. But the point is that they're very different animals. The community stations get no government funding at all.
Right. Well, I know as a fact one of our local classical music stations it does get government funding, and does host NPR programs such as like piano jazz and Live at the Met, and some.
Well, are you sure those are NPR? Because there's several different companies that provide programming to NPR stations. It may be coming out of an NPR radio station rather than being syndicated by NPR itself?
I'm telling you, this is brought to you by NPR. These are like NPR programs. They're just not.
Well, that's fine, Marty. I think we're in the weeds here. What's your point?
So my whole point is that for like classical stations, they shouldn't have to like compete with like Britney Spears and like Jay-Z to be on the radio. You know what I mean? We should have a forum for public radio to put on, like my son goes to bed every day listening to the classical programming. That wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't be able to listen to that on the radio waves if it wasn't publicly supported.
If this was 30 years ago, I'd agree with you, Marty. But right now, for $25, you can buy an MP3 player and load a bunch of good classical music into it for probably another $25 and put your son to sleep with it, and never again have to contribute to a radio station to do that for you.
That's true, but I think that there is So
why are we supporting an infrastructure like that with our tax dollars?
Because I don't think that great programming, I don't think that the classical and jazz stations would be able to survive if we didn't. And I think that those are part of our commons, and I think that should be something that we cherish. See,
I think the radio stations are part of our commons. The radio and television stations, but we're not. That ship sailed in 1996 when Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act. It's all been privatized, and I mean, part of it, your local public radio stations are run by local boards of directors, but it's still even though it's not for profit, it's essentially privatized. And it's not responsive to voters; it's responsive to its board of directors. So, and when I tune in at NPR and I hear Heritage Foundation spokespeople and Cato Institute spokespeople and politicians, particularly Republican and right-wing politicians, making statements that have no basis in fact and not being challenged or being treated very politely as if, this is very rational. There's no such thing as climate change or AT&T needs to merge with DirecTV because otherwise they won't survive. I'm thinking, why am I paying taxes for this?
And I completely agree that there are. I mean, that in situations like that, there are. There's no reason to.
There has been a serious effort, Marty, over the last 2 decades to inject right-wing content into public radio and public television, and they have been successful. And it's time that people woke up and realized that there's sometimes some really good reporting, and they've got bureaus and people all over the world, and what's her name, the woman with the Italian voice who's always reporting from the Vatican. I mean, there's some good reports. But the fact of the matter is that increasingly NPR is becoming National Petroleum Radio. They're not challenging the status quo. They're not challenging they're not outing the Koch brothers. In fact, David Koch succeeded in getting the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for pulling down a documentary about him, Citizen Koch. I'm very, very unhappy with the state of this. If we're going to have public broadcasting, it's going to be like BBC. It needs to be like BBC. It needs to be 100% government funded. It needs to be totally insulated from both corporate influence and government influence. And we have none of the above. And it's not working well in the United States. And that's my take on that. So and therefore, I think your real alternative programming there in Chicago is WCPT or in Evergreen Park in the Chicago area. You've got some progressive stations out there that are doing a really good job, and you've got community stations now that are starting to take on NPR, and they're carrying Amy Goodman with Democracy Now!, which is one of the best news shows out there. It so outshines NPR, it's startling. So anyway, I'm ranting.